We've seen conflicts between the courts and the president before historically. Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into the office of the presidency with a huge victory, electoral victory in 1936. And one of the political mandates he felt he had was to push through a progressive agenda on government regulation, making people's lives better, consumer regulation. We call this the New Deal. But the Supreme Court was in his way. The Supreme Court was striking down pieces of New Deal legislation sort of left and right. The court was more conservative than where the president and where Congress were. FDR basically said, we're going to very seriously consider packing the court. We're going to add new seats onto the Supreme Court until we start getting the rulings that we want. And he made that very publicly known. And so the Supreme Court sort of looked down the game tree, as we would say as social scientists, and started voting the other way. So eventually the Supreme Court started upholding pieces of FDR's legislation. This is very famously called the switch in time that saved 9. There are a couple of other examples where it's the president who backs down. And I think here probably the best example are the famous Nixon-Watergate tapes.
Good deal. Let's play it tough. That's the way they play it. That's the way we're going to play it.
Richard Nixon is subpoenaed. He has to turn over the recordings that he made when in the Oval Office. The case is litigated. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court orders Nixon to hand over the tapes to prosecutors. Now, at this point, Nixon could have refused to do that. He could have tried to ignore the Supreme Court's ruling on this. And so Nixon ends up turning over the tapes. He complies with the Supreme Court's ruling. We all know what happened next.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Now, a really important component in both of those examples is how popular and politically strong the president was going into this confrontation. In the case of FDR, we had a very strong president coming in with a very strong political and electoral mandate. In the case of Nixon, we had a very weak president with very little political support, even among members of his own party. In the current situation, we have a highly polarizing president. So we have a president who's extremely unpopular among Democrats, people not of his party, but pretty popular among the members of his own party. The fact that Trump has so much support from fellow Republicans in Congress will make him feel going into a potential conflict with the court very well supported politically.